To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm really excited and honored to be joined by our guests, Chanelle Gallant and Elene Lam, who are co-authors of the book Not Your Rescue Project, Migrant Sex Workers Fighting for Justice. Chanelle Gallant is an abolitionist feminist who has been fighting to free women's sexuality from criminalization for over 25 years. She is a frontline organizer, writer, thinker, and strategist. Chanelle co-founded the Migrant Sex Workers Project, Showing Up for Racial Justice Toronto, and is currently a visiting activist scholar at the Center for Feminist Research at York University. Chanelle, welcome to the Death Panel.
Hey, Beatrice. Thank you for having us.
And next we have Elene. Elene Lam has been a community organizer for over 2 decades. She is the founder of Butterfly, the Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Support Network. She was in the Critical Disability Studies program and is currently an assistant professor of social work at York University.
Hi, how are you? Great to join this podcast.
So today we're diving into the book that Elene and Chanelle co-wrote called Not Your Rescue Project, Migrant Sex Workers Fighting for Justice, which was recently published by Haymarket Books and is a fantastic text that is rich with movement history and demands nothing less than a total rethinking of how we talk about sex work, migration, violence, and care. Not Your Rescue Project is a razor-sharp and deeply grounded intervention into the dominating mainstream discourse around trafficking and sex work, myths that frame migrant women as helpless victims in need of saving, and the carceral state as their benevolent rescuer. This book also does a lot more than just debunk that narrative. It insists that we start from a different center of gravity, from the knowledge, resistance, and organizing of migrant sex workers themselves. It makes clear how rescue becomes a justification for punishment, and how care can become indistinguishable from control. So a lot of these themes in this book today are very relevant to a lot of the conversations that we've been having for years on Death Panel. And so I'm really excited today to be focusing in on the health and disability dimensions of this analysis, which I think are some of the most urgent and under-discussed aspects of this book. So we're going to talk about how the idea of health is mobilized to surveil, discipline, and exclude migrant sex workers from clinics, from housing, from public space, and how disability is produced through the violence of borders, police, evictions, and property. We'll also talk about what migrant sex workers are building in response to these regimes of extractive abandonment, because the book details powerful forms of mutual aid, peer-based care, and collective protection that make visible a very different kind of public health or health commons, one that's grounded in autonomy, dignity, and solidarity, not medical paternalism or moral panic. Not Your Rescue Project is truly a really politically clarifying book, and it brings the kind of analysis that's often left out of both leftist organizing and mainstream public health into full focus. And I think many of our listeners are going to find this book inspiring and galvanizing because it really names what we're up against, and it also shows what we're already doing to build something else. So Chanelle and Elene, thank you so much for being here today to talk about the book. I thought to start us off, we could talk a bit about how this project came together, and if you could both also talk about what you see as the kind of core political argument of the book and what you hope Not Your Rescue Project can offer readers.
Thank you for that introduction. It's really beautiful to be in a space where the ideas that we're discussing, like we get to actually really dig more deeply into them. And I'm excited to do that with the Death Panel audience because, as I mentioned before, we have never really been able to get into a more in-depth conversation about migration, sex work, racial capitalism, and health and ableism. So we're both really pumped to be here.
I think this book is so meaningful because it's like a kind of like record of our experience of organizing on the migrant sex worker justice. And so at that time, I was just like moved to Canada. And then before I moved to Canada, I have done the organizing of sex worker movement in Asia. And there was different projects so that I have a chance to learn from a lot of different sex worker group in different countries, how they do organizing. And when I moved to Canada, so that found there is a lot of sex worker organization, but seems like the migrant and like racial justice, particular Asian voice are missing.
I mean, I think we're going to get into this more, but one of the reasons that I was so excited to start working with Elene years before this book came together was because, Elene mentioned how the voices of racialized sex workers were really missing from the movement, in particular Asian sex workers. And I want to just underline one thing about that, which is like the problem with that isn't a lack of representation. It's not just some, surface tokenistic problem. The problem is that for me, as a longtime activist, what I was seeing is that our opponents would use myths about racialized sex workers, and in particular Asian sex workers, in order to promote their carceral agenda. They would claim this was good for, the trafficking victims in the massage parlors. There was absolutely no evidence of trafficking in the massage parlors in Toronto. But this lack of power of Asian and migrant, both massage and sex workers themselves, was letting people get away with these racist claims that they used to actually hold back sex workers' rights generally, and also promote these really intrusive and intense forms of police power, which eventually affected everyone, like increases in surveillance, increases in police budgets, like the development of entirely new investigation teams. And ultimately, what seems like a very small group of people who are impacted by something, in fact, affected everyone.
Can you both talk a little bit about sort of the core argument that the book lays out, just to give folks a way of sort of entering the text who might not have any familiarity with the book?
Yeah, I think that instead of start from the theory, or like the argument, so I think we have included a lot of story, right? The real life experience of the workers, how migrant sex worker can give them power, autonomy, how they experience various kind of like oppression, particularly from the law enforcement, but also how they organize to resist, right? I think this is itself is so powerful, as Chanelle say, the missing voice of the Asian migrant sex worker is being used against them, right? So, and I think this is a really, really important platform that we have include a lot of like story of the workers to make the voice be visible. And so, and I think our book have like different part, maybe Chanelle can describe a little bit more, but then the goal is really, really help people to understand what actually behind the rescue, right? So that like why we call it Not Your Rescue Project, because particularly many people on the left, so they suppose is support sex worker justice, support migrant justice, but then when they go to the human trafficking issue, and particularly even those who are against policing, against support prison abolitionists, like those people are also support the trafficking campaign, and particularly the support the many anti-trafficking initiative that give the law enforcement a lot of power, but also like continues uphold the problematic discourse about the worker. So, and I think one of the very, very important goal to really, really use different way to uncover what actually happened and help the people know about how like racism, sexism, like xenophobia, all kind of oppression is embedded on the anti-trafficking policy in the past and now, and then so to call for them to take action, right? So that's why we always say this is not the book to stay on the bookshelf. This is the book we really hope to use it to build a movement about how people can take action to bring the change. And the first step is understand what happened. I think Chanelle, maybe you can describe more.
One of the core reasons we wrote the book is that we saw that our own comrades, our own allies across the left actually held many of the same ideas about immigrants in the sex industry as our opponents. As in, our opponents were successful, and they're wrong. So many of our comrades hold ideas which are actually very racist, sexist, or phobic, ableist, and anti-worker about immigrants in the sex industry. And so sometimes not only fail to support immigrants in the sex industry, but actually work at cross purposes, actually oppose the work that immigrants in the sex industry are doing and that people in the sex industry across the board are doing. to fight for, fair working conditions, for labor rights, migration rights, et cetera. And so that's what we wrote this book for. We wrote this book to talk to people who don't, until now haven't had the opportunity to learn directly, like Elene said, from the firsthand stories, the struggle, the resistance, the political analysis of immigrants in the sex industry themselves. And remarkably, this is the first book to do that. This is the first book that we know of in the English language that is rooted in the actual firsthand stories and struggles of immigrants in the sex industry. And it's designed to just really lay out, because it is the first one, it's a primer. Who are migrant sex workers? Why do they migrate? Why are they selling sex? What are their actual struggles? And that's where we bring up state violence. A lot of the book focuses on the problems of state violence. And then how their oppression and how state violence masks itself through the anti-trafficking industry. And that's how many people end up falling for these really harmful carceral approaches to the sex industry, is because it's all Trojan horsed in through anti-trafficking laws and policies, which actually give the state and police incredible power and impunity over the lives of immigrant sex workers, including a total absence of labor rights, migration rights. The way we articulate it, migrant sex workers already lived in a police state prior to the kinds of conditions that we're seeing in the U.S. right now. And most people think they don't know that. They think that you mention immigrants in the sex industry and the association is with gangs of human traffickers instead of gangs of police and immigration agents. And that's actually what people should be thinking about. So that's what we wanted to do with this book.
It's such an important intervention. It's really a path-breaking work. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on the power of the archive, but I think it's not surprising in some ways, right, that this is the first book of its kind, because in many ways, this is a very important intervention in disability history. And one of the things that, is really intertwined with disability history and the history of migration is both the relationship to the state and legal regimes and the kind of question of the body politic and who is a worthy subject of the nation and who is a dysgenic, unwelcome presence in the body politic, but also the lack of a history by us about our lives, our experience, our organizing. A lot of the history of disability and migration and sex work exists in these archives of medicalization, of criminalization that are not about our actual lives. I mean, this is where the disability movement maxim of nothing about us without us kind of actually speaks to. It's not about representation. It's about creating for the first time a record that is actually written about us, about our experiences, right? And about our organizing in our lives. And this is something that, beginning with the self-advocacy movement, with the deinstitutionalization movement, you start to have a real attempt to create an archive of disability history. And this is something that, frankly, has also been left out of disability history for issues that range from white supremacy to respectability politics to ignorance, right? Which we can talk about later. But this is such an important intervention, specifically, not just because it makes this archival intervention and it makes this available, but because this is also, as you both are saying, a conversation that remains in this really oppressive, violent, racist, dominant mode because so many people think they know what they're talking about and they're completely ignorant of the voices and perspectives that actually can tell you something about this conversation.
Yeah, it's actually wild that we're recording this today because it happens to be the day of the celebration of life for Patty Byrne, who is the one of the founder of Sins Invalid and a core thinker behind disability justice. And we mention Sins Invalid in the book as one of the very few spaces that understands sex work as a site of disabled survival and thrival. But it absolutely is. And very few disability rights organizations or activists, and few movements in general are really, really willing to claim and embrace sex workers among them. But Sex workers are often, I mean, I don't even know where to start. There's so many threads of which we could enter a conversation about the intersections between sex work and disability. But I just want to lift up that the work that Patty did, that Sins Invalid has done, that the disability justice movement more broadly has done to respect sex work and sex workers is really unique and special and deserves to be acknowledged and celebrated.
Yes, I think this is so important to show the intersectionality. And I think that is like how it's also give us the hope, how to build the movement and moving forward, because like so often sex worker is also being seen either criminal or disabled body that take away the rights and power, right? So, and I think by building the movement, we challenge it and also like we created our own future. And I think this is very, very powerful and important. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I know that we wanted to start by taking a second to kind of talk through some of the, sort of basic foundations of who a migrant sex worker is or who migrant sex workers are. And, as we've mentioned, many of the kind of frames that you might encounter around this conversation are completely wrong. So I think it is one of those really important instances where starting with some of the basics can be really helpful. Do you both want to sort of talk a little bit about beyond the myth and the mystery of the kind of stereotype and the weaponized, caricature of sex work and trafficking and these, frames that we've been talking about, pushing back on? You want to talk about some of the actual truths and reality of who and what we're talking about, not the mythology of it.
Okay, here's a little thought experiment. Bring to mind your image of an immigrant woman in the sex industry and just get a little picture for yourself in your head of who you think that might be. And for most people, they're going to imagine a young woman. They're going to imagine her on her own, isolated, under control, maybe scared, and, lost in a new land by herself. And instead, actually, the majority of workers in the massage sector, anyways, which is a majority immigrant sector of the sex industry, are in their 30s to 60s. So instead of imagining kind of like a scared, lost, young 20-year-old, what you should be thinking of is like a savvy auntie who is like, right? Who like, and that's not what people are thinking of. They're not imagining like a 45-year-old mom of two who's like no nonsense, takes no bullshit, has lots of friends and community around her, really knows how to handle herself and her shit. But that's often what a migrant sex worker looks like. And that really confronts people's ideas of the kind of helplessness and the vulnerability of the story that we're told about immigrant sex workers. But, when, for example, in the research that Butterfly did in Toronto, they found that, well, first of all, they found that there were 0 minors in the massage sector. There was no one working under the age of 18, but 15% of the workers were actually over 55. So you're more likely to encounter a senior woman in a massage parlor than you are someone who's in their, late teens, early 20s. And I think that really ought to reorient us to the fact that we're talking about often an aging population of migrant workers who are choosing the massage sector, which may or may not include sexual services, because they actually want to move out of more physically demanding, dangerous, and sometimes debilitating work in other immigrant labor sectors.
Yeah, and I think that like when we talk about migrant sex work, sometimes we define, someone move from one place to other place, so that to engage in sex industries, no matter they identify themselves as sex worker or not. But we can see like there is also Canadian, US sex worker. They work in Thailand, in Hong Kong, in Japan, but they may not face the similar oppression and challenge as the racialized worker from global south to work in Europe or in Canada, right? So that instead of the migrant sex worker, the identity itself create the vulnerability actually is how, racism And also like the immigration, right? When you cross the border, the immigration take away your right and then make you be more vulnerable. So, and particularly as Chanelle said, like racialized people, they have like, because they speak different language, so that they may have like the language barrier, and then they will also have extra the vulnerability. But I think when they cross the border, they, because of the immigration policy, in particular against the racialized, like poor and much migrants. So that is really take away the power to make them face a lot of challenge. And I think this is also important when we understand the migrant sex worker is what is the issue or system that create their experience. And it's not migrant sex worker itself is like oppressive, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because ultimately, like, I think one of the things that gets disappeared out of this conversation through some of these dominant mythologies is an actual discussion of working conditions, broadly speaking, right? Like, what are the working conditions that someone has as the broad range of options to them if they are excluded from formal employment, or even if they have full access to formal employment, right? Like if you're working at Amazon, you give this example in chapter 2 where you talk about sex work being a less disabling workplace, actually, than many low-wage jobs, because you say, the average Amazon warehouse worker, I believe, like averages 10 to 30 miles a day of walking. And if you cannot stand for a whole shift, or if you're unwilling to put your body through these things because you don't want to be disabled as a result of it, there's a kind of wear and tear that, cleaning work, that hotel work, that childcare work, home health care work has on the body that goes unacknowledged.
Yeah. And I think like many people, even if they're supportive of sex workers, still feel a patronizing pity for migrant sex workers, for immigrant women in the sex industry. They still feel like, because I hear this from people who are very supportive of sex workers' rights, there's still an element of like, it's so sad that they have to do that. And it's deeply patronizing, because actually you should celebrate migrant sex workers for choosing a job that is often pays 5 to 10 times better than the last job they did, and is significantly less likely to result in some kind of debilitating injury at work. That doesn't mean you like the sex industry. Our politic does not depend on, does not require actually liking anything about sex work, and it doesn't matter. That's actually irrelevant, because workers in any industry usually organize because there's problems in the industry, not because they like it. And similarly for us, sex workers and migrant sex workers organize because the conditions can be really bad, because they can be exploitative, because the bosses can be abusive, because they don't have rights and control in their work. But we should be understanding the choice to sell sex as a way of hacking these horrible systems and finding an option that has potentially better autonomy, better control over the body. For example, with the sex industry, working class jobs are really designed to wear on and use up the body and then dispose of it. And that's the stereotype about sex work. But in reality, sex workers often have working conditions where they are able to sit, to take breaks, to choose their own shifts. And people don't think about the sex industry as a place where workers get to make their own accommodations. But often that is why people are choosing the sex industry. If they have some type of health condition where they need to be able to change their schedule, or they need to be able to choose to not go into work on a day and go in on another day, most of the time, low-wage workers can't do that. But sex workers are more likely to be able to do that, and to have more autonomy over their working conditions, instead of this hyper-fixation on what's seen as the sexual deviance of sex work, to really focus on pragmatic concerns like, can you do this work for a wage that you can live on? Can you set your own schedule? Can you choose not to go into work on a day when you're experiencing some really bad symptoms or a flare? And that's really the pragmatic decisions that go into the choice to be a sex worker, versus the focus, this like hyper focus that most people have on the sex part of sex work, and not the aspects of just like surviving and getting by and figuring out how to hack racial capitalism in a way that best protects your body.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.